Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NCOSS New South Wales Budget Learning Session. My name is Ben McAlpine. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at NCOSS, and I would start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of traditional custodians, and for me, that is the Gadigal people, and I would wish to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and like Thomas, if you want to please acknowledge the lands on which you are joining this call on. Really excited to be having Catherine McGovern with us today. I'll introduce her in a moment, but just a few housekeeping matters. We will have time for questions. It's a critical part of this workshop, but we're going to do our best to hold questions until the end if we can, and I'll let Catherine guide us through that. If you want to be asking questions, please use the chat box. We will be sharing all of this, the resources, as I said earlier, on our website. And because we value learning and continuous improvement, we'll be doing a poll at the end. So we'd appreciate everyone's input on that. Before I hand over to Catherine, just a few quick words on why we're doing today's session and some elements of context. So this is an annual piece of training that we do because we recognize that the sector needs to be able to collectively understand how the New South Wales government is budgeting for social services and related services and policy decisions. And we want to be able to provide this type of support to each of you so that you can better understand what is it that the government is saying with its budget and through its budget, and what does that mean for your work, and also what does that mean for your individual and then our collective advocacy. I would note that NCOSS is expecting this budget to be an interesting one. It's going to be one with some unique challenges. So we will be watching very carefully. So it's a few things. It's a new government. So they've already delayed it to give themselves, in their perspective, enough time to really go through the books and understand the true picture. And so that they may then present their own budget. That will come with priorities, but there is clear messaging already that you will hear lots of messages already around debt, deficit, and these beautiful phrases of black holes, billions of dollars sitting in black holes. And I'm sure Catherine will start to talk a little bit about that. At this point, I would not be expecting any big announcements around big levels of expenditure, or at least new expenditure. But from an NCOSS perspective, we will still be expecting them, despite recognising that there are some budgetary challenges. We will expect them to still respond to critical issues around housing and the cost of living. So we will be watching very carefully, and we will be playing the best role that we can to bring that clarity on the night and then in the days and weeks afterwards to the sector and also back to government. One other thing I would frame up is that I would expect this set of budget papers could be difficult to quickly understand. With a new government, there will be changes in the machinery of government. Funding will be moved between different departments. So it could be difficult for everyone to understand. It may look like something is new funding, but in fact, it's been funding moved. Or it could be that it looks like that particularly we would expect significant funding in the area of out-of-home care, but I don't think that will be new funding. That will be this black hole that they're talking about. So we will need to be careful not to get overly excited about what appears like a big new investment, when in fact it may just be extending existing investment. So it's not new, it's not additional. So that will be a challenge that we'll have to work through. So there may be lots of questions on the night that we won't collectively be able to answer, and we will do our best to help us all work through that, like I said, on the day and in the days and weeks afterwards. But on that note, I want to introduce our facilitator today. So Catherine McGovern, thank you so much for being here with us today and walking us all through this. Catherine's had quite a very interesting and astoundingly varied career. So she brings a lot of that depth of experience from being a political advisor at a federal level, in banking, senior executive roles in health and pharmaceuticals across Australia and Europe. She's been heavily involved locally in recent years in organisations like Medibank as the General Manager of Government and Public Affairs. And since then, she founded her own consultancy in 2012. So she'll be bringing all of that expertise, all that experience. She has an immense knowledge around governments, government budgets, how budget papers work. And fortunately for us, she also has a really good understanding of our sector, because she's as an example, she's a current board member of Marriott Support Services, and she's been involved in Melbourne City Mission and Victoria Legal Aid. So she's been involved in our sector. She understands our sector. So hopefully all of that will set her up to walk through a really important session today. So Catherine, I might stop there and hand over to you, please.
Fantastic, and thank you very much. I come to you today from Wurundjeri land, so I'm actually not even in New South Wales. I apologise. I'm just trying to share my screen.
We will forgive you for that.
Where's my screen? Beautiful. Just need to get this viewing properly. This was working a moment ago, Rosalita, and it's gone off again. Apologies.
I see what you mean. Your buttons are a bit strange.
If you try to click slideshow, does that help at all?
Yes, I did, and it's gone. Is that working? Presenter view. Unfortunately, it's still then showing the slide behind. If I do that, does that help?
If you go back, Catherine, and just press from the start instead of, or try to click Use Slideshow.
Up the top. Isn't this fun? All of this collective help desk.
I know. Apologies.
That's perfect. Not at all.
Perfect. Rosalita and I had it working perfectly, and I was quite confident it would not work when we started. So.
Right.
As always happens.
How it goes.
Well, thank you very much for having me today to join you for this session. Budgets, as Ben said, are usually traditionally quite challenging to read, even in normal years. But really, I know some of you have joined us before on this annual session. It's really good to revisit it, on a regular basis, because budgets can change, but also it's not something any of us do every day. None of us get up every day and go to the budget papers, or at least I really hope you don't. And therefore revisiting it regularly is really helpful for being able to have a view of what you're looking for, why you're looking at the budgets, and what that can, what you're trying to find. So, oops, next. Ben's already given you an overview of me, so I won't repeat that. But I guess really my focus, to be honest, is really about that policy, strategic and political advice, healthcare, economics, and really helping people understand what governments are doing, what's driving them, how to interact with governments, and what you need to be able to understand to really present with them well and understand what they're saying. I think a lot of us in the roles that we do a lot of translating work where we translate our organisations to government and governments back to our organisation. And it's sort of like understanding multiple languages, and understanding budget languages is critical. So the outline of the presentation, I'm just going to take you through the context. Ben's done a bit of the context for the New South Wales government budget this year. I'm going to take you through what the budget process looks like. I'll probably look at that from a normal year rather than this year particularly, just because it will help you think about next year. What's in the budget, or in a budget, because that is pretty standard. How to present, how to approach a budget. So I will be saying prepare well, plan well. You're going to hear me say this numerous times in this presentation, so I'm warning you in advance. what you can expect to see in the budget, what information's in a budget, how the New South Wales budget papers are actually structured, and then a bit about how to read them and what you're looking for, as well as some pitfalls. Ben's already mentioned the machinery of government changes that come, and some of the, where budgets move or funding moves from one portfolio to another, the habits that every government has of re-announcing funding that they've announced previously. And then finally, we'll talk about how to check your information. When you've got a handle on what you think you're seeing from the budget papers, how you can go back and actually see if that's accurate and anything that you might have missed. So this is, as Ben said, the first budget for this government. They've moved it back because of the fact that they've come into government and they've faced significant economic pressure, but also the timing. We've seen, it's quite normal for governments to change the timing of the budget when they are new, give themselves enough time to look at what's happened, get across the minutiae of the budget. This government has come in at a very challenging time. They're facing extremely significant economic pressure, increased interest payments like the rest of the Australian community. If you look at what they're forecasting at the moment, they're saying in 3 years' time, the New South Wales government will be paying $7 billion a year in interest payments alone. Now, that's money that can't be spent on police, community, legal aid, housing, cost of living pressures. Debt's rising at the same time, so those interest payments aren't going down. There are a lot of program overruns, particularly in areas like transport infrastructure. I know the Sydney Metro tunnel's running well over budget by about $12 billion. The Metro tunnel or the Western Harbour tunnel is also running over, and it's only been signed since last December. Cost of living pressures. And there's a lot of programs, Ben mentioned, out of home care, where funding just seems to have ceased. So going forward in the years, there's not funding allocated in future years for a whole variety of things, including things like fire trails, the cybersecurity unit, as I mentioned, out of home care. So the government really came in with this desire to do a comprehensive line-by-line review, as they called it, of spending, with the aim of determining what savings they could make. And I think that goes back to Ben's comment about what type of budget we might expect here. This is not looking like a budget full of new funding. It's looking like a budget where they work out what they can save, where they really need to allocate money. I don't think they're going to sort of take money, from areas which really desperately need it and the community needs, but they're going to be looking for a lot of efficiencies and anywhere where there's any so-called fat in the budget. So every budget is pretty much the most important document a government brings down in any single year. It covers politics, it covers social expectations, social policy. It tells you what the economic environment looks like and what the government expects the economic environment to be in the next few years. It's how governments raise money or appropriate, is a technical word, how they appropriate funds to pay for services and programs. And you can see this, it's not something that happens in Australia, but if you look at America, governments who can't appropriate funding run out of money and can't pay for their programs or pay for staff, pay the civil service even. Looking at the budget, you'll actually see what the government priorities are. It's a really good indication of what the government thinks it should spend money on. And it provides information not just on this budget year, the year that we're in, but also the following 3 years. So what funding you're expecting to see during those years, and that period is called the forward estimates. As I said, this has been a bit of a different year just because of the fact that with the election, the government changed the budget cycle. But traditionally, and you can expect this to go back to pretty much normal next year, the budget cycle really begins in December with portfolios, departments, looking at what their priorities might be for the next year, looking for what they actually want to spend money for, looking at what their stakeholders expect. There's usually a senior minister's review during January, and then portfolio budget submission. So what each department and agency in government wants in the budget is put forward in about February, late February, early March. The expenditure review of the cabinet then goes through all of those budget submissions. They're usually looking for savings. They're a group not known for looking to spend money. They're usually looking to save money, partly because of the fact that most departments do put in requests for more money. Very few departments, having worked with a few during this process, very few government departments go to government saying, we'd like less money. There's then a budget cabinet at the end of that process of ERC where they look at all of what they've come through, what the recommendations are, and they determine what the budget should be. That then is announced in New South Wales in June usually, and then the appropriations bills, so the legislation that's needed to actually make the budget work, that's then passed by the end of the month to allow for the next financial year to begin. And then we start the process of examining the budget. So the budget estimates, where politicians get to ask public servants about what's in the budget, how the budget's performing. And then we have the annual reports of departments, agencies and so forth later in the year. And then the half-year review, usually in November, in December. And that usually just gives a bit of an update about, are the forecasts tracking well, what government's seeing, and any changes that are important. And as I said, you have the forward estimates, so the 3 years of the forward estimates of the budget, but you also have parallel processes within the budget. At the moment, part of this year's budget will be reporting on last year's budget, saying what the outcome of last year's budget was. So it actually says last year's budget, we spent this money or we didn't spend this money. This is the surplus, this is the deficit. You've got the budget year we're in. So actually, what are the processes and the reporting requirements and actually fulfilling those? And then you're already starting, we people in government departments, particularly in Treasury, already starting about next year's budget, even before this year's budget's announced. So it's really important not just to read the budget that you've got in front of you, the budget that's announced on budget night, but actually to understand the context that budget sits in within the budgets either side of it and the preparation for next year's budget. So in terms of what's in a budget, most importantly, the budget is actually a statement of what governments expect to spend and what they expect to raise in terms of revenue. So how much money are we going to get in? How much money are we going to get out? And what are we going to spend it on? And in New South Wales, you report that intent about expenditure and revenue raising against what are now 39 state outcomes. So there were 37 previously. Every now and again, somebody adds a new one. So we're now at 39, and I'll talk about those in some more detail later. But it reports against where the money will be spent and raised against those, and other statements and specific items that they're going to spend money on, or new taxes, new sources of revenues, adjustments to revenue raising. The budget also has a lot of policy in it. It tells you what governments think are important and often why. That why is often really important to note, and also what the intent is. We're going to spend money to buy what? And that's quite important, particularly for people in the social services sector, because you can go back to governments at a later point and say, well, your plan was to buy or to spend money to achieve this. That's not achieving this. You might wish to look at that money and spend it differently. It's got the accounts that relate to all of that. And importantly, the budget has a whole group of information about financial assumptions about the economy. What is economic growth going to be? What income levels are we going to have as a government and therefore as a society? What sort of tax rates are we going to have? What are the interest rates going to be? And what are employment going to be? And those assumptions are really important because they can tell you whether, if you look at some of those assumptions and think, oh, they don't look right, and so forth, it gives you an example of whether an indication of how strong that budget might be, or whether there might need to be changes in it in future years. As I said, in terms of approaching a budget, prepare really well. I'm going to take you through a few things like, why are you reading the budget? What are you interested in the budget? Where are the things that you're actually interested in currently in the budget papers? And actually looking at what's happened previously, because that's quite important in working out, for example, as we were talking about earlier, whether it's new money, old money, money being re-announced. So why are you actually reading the budget in the first place? And I think it's really helpful to be clear about that. Are you planning to update your members or stakeholders because of what you find out in the budget? Are you planning to go to government and advocate for changes to the budget or more money for an area? Are you trying to tell your board what's happened in the budget so that they have a better understanding about the environment? Or are you trying to say to the media, look, this is the right thing, the wrong thing, we're really pleased about this outcome or not? And then what are you going to do with that information? Are you going to brief people on critical issues, either internally or externally, write media releases, write board papers? If you can do any of those things with the information you find, it's really helpful to actually do like a template or prepare an outline of those in advance. It actually means that you know what sort of structure you're looking for on budget night. It can save a lot of time and effort on budget night and the days afterwards if you're clear about why you're reading the budget papers and what you want to tell people once you've read them. And what issues are you looking at? Homelessness, mental health, cost of living, we've already mentioned, social housing, health, education, community support. There's a lot of information in the budget. What are you actually interested in? And really try and work out that in advance. And in the event that you have a team, give each of those issues to somebody else so that you're spreading the load of reading the budget and you're not all looking at the same thing at the same time. It means it's a lot more efficient and a lot easier if you have those people to share with. But just be clear about what you're looking for in the budget. And then once you're clear about what you're looking for, identify where your issues have been in the budget previously. What portfolio do they live in? Do they live in, planning and environment? Are they in transport? Or are they in community and justice? Look at last year's budget papers and work out where they were reflected last year's, because that's a good indication of where they're likely to be this year, allowing for those changes of machinery of government. But those outcomes, the outcomes under which your issues sit, are probably going to be the same this year as they were last year. They're probably still trying to achieve the same thing. So go back and look at that budget, work out what you're looking for, work out where it was last year, work out which budget outcome your issues relate to. And then if you're expecting something new, where do you think it might belong? Go and look at last year's budget papers or ministerial press releases and work out where you think those things might belong. So you're ahead of the game in terms of preparing for budget night and the days after to work out where you think you need to look first. Also look at last year's budget papers if you're thinking about what money might be changing or which revenue streams or expenditure streams might be changing. Look at last year's budget papers to see what they said was going to be spent. What outcomes were they going to achieve? What were the success measures? Have those success measures been met? And what announcements have been made since? Often there's announcements, either in the lead up to the budget or particularly this year for you with an election in your state. What things have been said about this since that might change what will be in this year's budget papers? So you're really getting ahead of the game in terms of knowing what you're looking for, knowing what's been said previously, and therefore being in a position to more accurately identify any changes. And the budget, there are so many sources of information, about a budget, which is one of the reasons I really recommend working out what you're looking for in advance, because you don't want to be overwhelmed by the number of pieces of paper and so forth. Actually work out what you want to find so you actually can find it quickly without wasting time on things you don't need to look at. Pre-budget announcements and releases, every government likes to leak bits of its budget in advance, whether that's to identify whether the people will like it or dislike it, whether there'll be backlash, or also just to get some good media coverage if they can. So start watching for those already. Some of them may have been, that might have started. The budget papers themselves are really important. They go up usually pretty much as the Treasurer starts speaking. The Treasurer's budget speech, the Treasurer's media releases. And then there's lots of specific papers as well in the New South Wales system on, Western Sydney, regional New South Wales. Last year, there was a brand new budget paper released called the Women's Opportunity Statement. this government might release some new statements because they might have some different priorities from the last government. So they might actually want to give a different lens to some areas. Look at other ministers' media releases. If your area is not necessarily going to be in the Treasurer's papers or the Premier's papers, look at your specific minister. If you're interested in community and justice, look at what that minister said. Look at their website, see what's released. A lot of fact sheets are released. And there's also media. People often underestimate how useful, the media spend years in many instances. There are people I know who have been to budget lockups in the media for sort of 30, 40 years. They're really quite expert, many of them, at reading budget papers. And therefore, actually reading what they've written is a really good way also of finding out what's happening. So in terms of the structure of the budget papers in New South Wales, the first budget paper is the budget statement, overall overview of the state's finances, all of those assumptions I mentioned earlier. Budget paper 2 is really reporting to the government agencies and the impact of policies. What are the outcomes that each agency is supposed to be getting? Budget paper number 3, and we'll talk about this a bit later in more detail, just because last year we had quite a detailed discussion about infrastructure, about 3 and 4. It really details some of the information about infrastructure investment, while budget 4 does the agency financial statements. So each piece of state government agencies, the actual financial statements of what's in there. It's also quite important because it also covers machinery of government changes. And then budget 5, I'm not going to talk about budget 5 probably at all after this, unless anybody's got a question. It really just talks about where the money is and then the legislation needed to deliver the budget. I confess I'm not a lawyer. I don't particularly like reading legislation, and budget 5 is the paper that I think most lay people read least often. So as I said, budget number 1, the budget statement, has the key budget highlights. What's the position fiscally? How much money is coming in? How much money is going out? What's the government's strategy and what's their outlook? What are they expecting? What's the overview of the economic environment? What are some of the assumptions they're making and what risks do they identify? So most governments will identify in this budget paper, what are the risks to the achievement of this budget? Is it higher cost of living? Is it problems with supply? Are we expecting infrastructure costs to go up? Any new revenue measures are usually identified in budget paper 1, together with consolidated expense, revenue and budget sheets. So often you'll find new funding in these, although you might not always find the actual allocation. You might find that there's new funding, but it might not tell you precisely where that funding's going. And this is also really important that the forward estimates are usually in this document also. Budget number 2 is the outcome statement, and we'll probably use cluster 8, stronger communities, as the example on this. But it's organised in 10 clusters, so groupings of priorities fundamentally. So what are the outcomes the government's trying to achieve? So stronger communities is 1, education, health, and then there are 39 state outcomes, as I mentioned before. And these are, what do we want? We're spending this money to do what? So people have a safe, affordable place to live. There's the best start in life for young children. And children and families thrive. So there's some of the outcomes under the stronger communities cluster. But every single cluster and every single outcome has details of what the programs are for the outcome that the government's trying to achieve, what money is being spent within that outcome, what policies are there, some of the success measures. So how are they actually going to measure whether they've achieved it, and some of the performance data. So this is just really a graphic of the same thing. You have the outcome indicators, outcome 1, outcome 2. Then you've got all of the programs that fit within that. So you can see that in the written budget papers. And then in budget paper 4, you can see it from the agency perspective. So that then looks at it agency by agency, program by program. So the outcome statement does outcome, then program, The agency papers do agency then program. So just as I said, we're just going to use the Stronger Communities cluster as an example of what this looks like. So first of all, within budget paper 2, it will say what the cluster's purpose is. And in this instance, the Stronger Communities cluster's purpose is to deliver community services that support a safe, just and brighter future for New South Wales. There are a variety of outcomes within the cluster. They're all noted there. And the ones that I've put in orange are new from last year. So they have actually changed. And it's always that's one of the other reasons why it's really important to have a look at what was there last year, so you can identify any changes. So since 2021-22, the government actually added disasters and communities, efficient and effective legal system, and so forth, to make sure that they were reflecting what had happened in the community over the year, and the fact that these are now more important and have been raised up the priority level. Then it details some of the key programs that support delivery of those outcomes. So things like child protection, homelessness services, supporting the NDIS are just some of those. And then it has, it reports investments in each cluster, in each outcome within the cluster. So what are we actually going to spend to achieve the outcome? And that adds up, obviously, to what the cluster is going to receive overall. And then it reports to identified performance indicators for each outcome. So just again, we're just going to look at the Stronger Communities cluster. I'll keep looking at that. So here you've got the outcome. The cluster is the Stronger Communities cluster. The outcome is that children and families thrive. So number 1, programs that exist to deliver that are out of home care and permanency support. You've got child protection, targeted early intervention, and domestic family and violence. So there's some of the things that are actually, here are the programs that are going to support achieving the outcome. You've got it noted how much money is going to be spent, both in recurrent expenditures and capital expenditure on that outcome. And below, you've actually got how the government is going to decide whether this outcome was achieved or not. The number of people who are charged with a domestic violence assault, the proportion of young people and children who are reported at risk of serious harm, and so on and so forth. So in each one of these, you can see what the government's trying to achieve, and then you can actually determine whether you think, from the policy expertise you all have, whether the programs that are being delivered are going to help achieve those. And if not, it gives you an indication of how you might wish to have those changed, or comments you might want to make to next year's budget. So budget number 3 is the infrastructure statement, which may be of relevance to various of you, particularly those dealing with local communities, regional New South Wales and so forth. It also is important because it doesn't just reflect transport infrastructure. I think many of us think about infrastructure and think about roads and bridges and so forth. But importantly, delivering the infrastructure pipeline covers things like education, skills, and health. It's also got a variety of programs that are within the the Restart New South Wales Fund. So, I mentioned before Sydney Metro West, but things like the Housing Acceleration Fund, and also quite a lot of regional projects. It also tells you, importantly, where those projects will be funded from. So, whether it's going to be funded from new tax, whether it's going to be just normal funding, whether it's coming from other government enterprises. Oops. And then budget paper 4 is the agency financial statements. So this reports on all of the state government agencies, everything that undertakes a state government activity. So departments and other organisations within the state government infrastructure. Again, this paper reports in the clusters. So knowing which clusters you're interested in is really important. It describes the machinery of government changes. So it actually intends to point you to where things have changed within the structure of government. So, for example, If a program has traditionally been managed by one particular department and the government decides to move that program to another department or even to another agency within the same cluster, this is where you'll find that information. So if something was going to move from the Department of Planning and Environment and instead it was going to be looked after by the Environment Protection Agency, this is where you would find that information traditionally. And as I said, it reports in clusters. So all of the agencies within one cluster are reported within that. So the Planning and Environment cluster has, for example, the Department of Planning and Environment within it. It reports on the Environment Protection Agency, the Sydney Olympic Park Authority, and about 9 other government agencies. So these are really important if you're trying to work out what fits within which organisation that you manage or you deal with and that you interact with. So in terms of how to read the budget, I've taken you through, getting prepared, trying to work out what's there, what you're interested in, why you're trying to learn this information, who you're trying to share it with, what's in each of the budget papers, but then actually reading the budget papers and reading, various of the other documents associated with the budget. How would I actually recommend you go about that? So I always think that starting with the budget speech is a really good idea. It's a good overview about what the government actually thinks is important. Sometimes treasurers strangely try to not say bad news in the budget speech. So it's why it's a good overview, but I wouldn't rely on it by itself. But you'll get some of the key announceables and some of that top line information about which way the government thinks the economy is going. Read the budget overview. So there's usually a short paper that just gives you an overview, a top line of the budget. Budget 1 looks at priorities and top line financials. I'd always look at that. And then read budget paper 2 for that cluster information, the changes to the cluster, the budget highlights, and the financials, including the investment in programs that you and your organisation are interested in. And then really budget papers 4 and 5 are more for those who are interested in specific, interest in infrastructure, in local projects, in local/regional projects, and machinery of government changes. And then once you've done that, you can compare it to the information you've researched in advance. You can compare it to budget media releases. So go and look at the budget media releases on the issue that you're interested in, and any statements or fact sheets from the relevant minister. And those fact sheets can be really interesting. I work with an organisation who federally this year were expecting a really big announcement, and it wasn't mentioned in the budget papers. They couldn't find it. They could find the money that was allocated to things that looked like their issue, but they weren't mentioned. And then in a fact sheet of the relevant minister, they and the other issues that they thought were similar to them were all listed out. And somehow they had simply just fallen out of the budget paper, but they were in the fact sheet and they actually did receive the money they were hoping for. So do look at those fact sheets and those other documents. And then you can use that information to sort of build a picture about what's being announced. Look at it against what's been announced before, see if it is actually new spending, because that's really important. And then check other spending areas to confirm that they're continuing projects that you're interested in. Have there been decreased funding numbers? Has funding, and I hate to say this, has funding just disappeared out of the budget papers? That can happen, and it does happen. So do look for that. And have there been changes in the estimates or forecasts or reporting? And one of the things I have noticed just looking at some of the New South Wales budget papers, we used to have these things called Premier's priorities, which sat alongside the clusters and the outcomes, and they seem to have disappeared. They might just have been something that the previous government had, but it's worth keeping an eye on changes like that just to see whether the government, this government might reintroduce those and might have a new set of Premier's priorities. In terms of things to be careful about, be really careful about governments re-announcing spending that they've announced before. Every government in Australia, I suspect probably the world, does this. It can be hard to check, but actually just be aware of what's been announced before, and this is where your preparation comes in key. Prepare for it in advance, and then you can go back and say, oh no, I think that's new funding. That's new funding, or I think that's old funding. Government's hiding changes to the budget. governments don't really like to announce bad news. So if they've tried to stop funding, they will try and make that as hard to find as possible. Machinery of government changes, again, as Ben mentioned at the very beginning, that can make things hard to identify. If something's moved to another portfolio, has it moved and also changed in the amount or not? And then government's not spending announced money. I was at a very interesting federal budget thing earlier in the year, where the Minister for Health announced that he had identified that 4% of the federal health budget was never spent due to people either not identifying their criteria or not meeting criteria. But there's 4% of money in the federal health budget that's not actually being spent, which does open the idea about, well, how could that money be spent? It's been allocated. It would only go back to government general revenue. How could you actually try and encourage that money to be spent on areas that were favourable to you? And then finally, the last pitfall is not checking papers properly. The easiest way of doing this, Control F is your best friend. Use it for any word you're looking for, any phrase you're looking for. Check all of the relevant words and do it throughout the papers if you're looking for something in specific. It is one of the most fail-safe ways of finding what you're looking for. And then once you've done all of that, how can you check that you've got it right? Go back and recheck the budget papers. Always double check what you think you've read. You might actually read it the second time and have a different interpretation. Search by term. Share it with a colleague if you're in doubt and actually talk about what you think you've seen. Look at other sources of information. They're really helpful in double checking that what your interpretation is right. There are a lot of analyst accounts of budgets. A lot of other peak bodies write one. There is no shame in reading somebody else's budget summary and nicking a piece of it. Most of us have done that at some point in our lives or used somebody else's summary to check what we like. A lot of agencies, a lot of PR agencies, a lot of lobbyist firms and others put out summaries of the budget. Newspapers put out summaries of the budget. So go and have a look at those sources of information. Check with your colleagues, both in your own organisation and at other organisations if you share an interest. And the other thing you can always do, because as I said, sometimes you are going to get to the point of going, hang on, is this here or isn't it? Call contacts that you have in the relevant department. Governments know that papers are hard to read and there's always questions about budgets. People are always going to have them, and don't feel any embarrassment or hesitation to pick up the phone and ring somebody and say, I think I'm reading this, am I right? Or this seems to have disappeared. Is that correct? There's a lot of useful websites. Here's just some of them with New South Wales, the budget process, and all of the papers, New South Wales media releases, the budget papers, and then just one example of the Department of Community and Justice's news and media website. But every single department will have one of those. Know the ones you're interested in and earmark them in advance so you can go and find them quickly on budget day. So I've been talking a lot and I've been relatively quick. I just didn't want to run too far over time, but I'm obviously open to questions. So please just go ahead and ask anything that you're interested in.
Not sure if Ben is still online, Catherine, but there are a couple of questions and feedback as well in the chat box.
Yeah. Oops.
There's two from Francesca.
Stop sharing so we can. Okay. Sorry.
Would you like me to read them out?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, that'd be very kind.
Okay. All right. So Frankie's asking, has anyone else found it difficult? Oh, okay. That's the second one. I'll go to the first one. Is the structure of the budget papers legislated? Could they change the structure at all?
No, it's not legislated, and it has changed in New South Wales over the years. What actually has to be reported, there's a lot of things that have to be reported, so they could change the structure. The structure has been as it is now for quite a few years, and I'd be surprised if they changed it, because I think one of the things this government will want to do is that they will want to enable that. So one of the reasons, most common reasons that governments change the structure of the budget is to hide something. I don't think this government's going to want to hide what happened between them and the last government. This has been quite a respectful handover of governments, but I think they'll probably want to have the comparison relatively easy to find, particularly of those things of, they've already said that there's a lot of programs, and this happened federally as well at the change of government. There's a lot of programs that the previous government did not fund into the future forward estimates. I think they're going to want people to be able to see that. So I don't think there'll be that much. I'm not expecting a huge change, particularly given the fact that those papers have been stable for quite a few years now. I think they might add a few specific, depending on their priorities, they might add a few specific ones, like the one last year on women's opportunity. So there might be some extra things added or some extra fact sheets, but I don't think they'll change them wholesale.